Okay, so what we're going to be looking at today is what we call the loanable funds market. And what this market deals with is the amount of supply, the supply of money out there that's basically for people to borrow. So, what we're looking at here, savers and borrowers, where they can exchange funds. All right, so how much loanable funds are out there, okay, and at what interest rate. So if you're wanting to borrow money, how much is it going to cost you, and how much is up there? Okay, so this graph's going to have a supply and demand for loanable funds. Okay, the demand for loanable funds is going to come from households, firms, basically businesses, um, governments, and the foreign sector. So basically, when you talk about the demand of loanable funds, you look at who is wanting to borrow money and how much they want to borrow, and how many people are wanting to borrow can affect the real interest rate, or basically can affect how much that money is going to cost to be borrowed. Okay, the supply comes from savings. When households, when businesses save money, okay, that increases the supply of money, loanable funds. Okay, um, we're looking at how much should um, individuals save, and that's going to determine how much people are able to borrow. Okay, so here's your equilibrium for loanable funds. Okay, notice we have our real interest rate over here. Okay, you have quantity of loanable funds down here. Okay, real interest rate, quantity, demand, supply. All right, so changes in demand. So when people want to borrow money, okay, that's affecting the um, demand of loanable funds. So the more borrowing that takes place, okay, there's a higher demand. So that's going to cause the demand curve for loanable funds to shift to the right. Okay, less borrowing, um, it will shift to the left. Okay, so some of your examples here: government deficit spending. Okay, so what that means, when the government is spending money that they don't technically have, they're spending in a deficit. So more borrowing, government, okay, more demand for loanable funds. So just like with anything, think of when demand increases for stuff, what typically happens to the prices of those goods when they're in higher and higher demand? Well, they increase. So when there's a higher amount of borrowing and a higher demand of loanable funds, we tend to see, okay, a increase in the real interest rate. So what that money is going to cost you, okay, to borrow. Well, if more people want to borrow, okay, well, it's going to cost more and more money to um, basically borrow that same amount of money. Okay, less investment demand, less borrowing. Okay, less people are wanting to borrow. Okay, well, you can't charge higher interest rates on loans if less people are wanting to borrow money. The whole way you can get people to borrow more money is charge a lower interest rate. So you're not going to see a decrease in demand for loanable funds followed by an increase in the interest rate. Then no one's ever going to want to borrow money. All right, so here's your increase. Okay, again, we're just going to shift the demand curve to the right. There's your labels. So you can see interest rate increases. Okay, the quantity demanded increases. All right, and here's your shorthand at the bottom. Interest rate, quantity, both increase. Okay, here's your decrease. We're just going to shift it to the left. Bingo. All right, so changes in supply of loanable funds. All right, so remember, supply of loanable funds, saving, when for the change in loanable funds, basically more people save, the more loanable funds are available. Okay, less saving, less loanable funds. So Your example, government surplus. All right, when the government has more money than they need, okay? When there's an increased supply of something, the interest rate is going to drop. Think about goods. When we have an increased supply in a certain good, price tends to lower, trying to get rid of that. Okay. When we increase the supply of loanable funds, we see lower and lower interest rates. Okay. Decrease in consumer spending here. All right. Or marginal propensity to save. Okay. Meaning consumers are spending more money or they have less ability to consume, to save money. All right. So when there's less and less supply of loanable funds out there, okay, the supply is going to decrease. All right. And then we're going to see an increase in interest rate. There's less supply of funds out there. If you want those funds, it's going to cost you more. Okay. We're going to see an increase in the interest rate. All right. So here would be your increase. All right. Simple graph. There you go. Okay. Increase. Here's the decrease. All right. So with loanable funds, okay, the loanable funds market is going to determine your real interest rate. All right. This is talking about saving and borrowing. Okay. Changes in saving and borrowing create changes in loanable funds. All right. Depending on the habits of the government and habits of the consumer. Okay. Government fiscal policy, what they decide to do, print more money, print less money. All right. And that interest rate is very important because it affects the gross private investment, which, if we remember, we go all the way back to aggregate demand and GDP. Okay. Gross private investment, one of the key components of our GDP. Is our economy growing? Well, if those interest rates get too high, too low, it can affect the gross private investment. Think currently what the government is doing, creating lots of loanable funds, okay, increasing the supply of money because of COVID with all those stimulus packages, all right. And what they were doing was trying to drive down the interest rate, okay, keeping rates super, super low so that gross private investment would continue. So people would be still willing to take out loans, create those jobs, try and get the economy back on its feet.